In this tutorial, we're going to build on the hunger system and add some items and equip them to our little character here. So I've renamed the scene from the last tutorial into items and equipping tutorial, and that scene's open. And we're going to start by checking out our player. And we'll open up the player script. Because we're going to be using the items, that means we're going to have an inventory. So I'm going to implement I have inventory. And now underneath our game module lists, we're going to create two new lists. Game item object list for inventory, and we'll copy that for equipment. Now in this demo scene, our equipment's just going to be another game item object list. In your project, you may have a very different equipment system, so hopefully this will give you what you need to get started, but it won't be dictating to you exactly how your equipment system, or inventory system for that matter, should work. And that is what the game modules is all about, giving you helpful ways of doing things without forcing you to do your game any particular way. So I also know that I'm going to want a player inventory script, so let's go ahead and add that now. Alright, with our namespace set there, we're going to start by creating a private reference to our player. And we'll set that in awake. And let's make two properties for our player inventory and player equipment, just to make it a little bit easier to work with those later. Now we know we're going to have to equip, and we're going to have to unequip, but we'll come back to this script in a little bit. So now it's time to create the items. Now items in the game modules are often going to be swords and objects that you can pick up and hold, things like that, weapons and armor and other things, items that you can use. But they can also be used in many different ways. So definitely use your imagination and think about other ways that you can use the items component in a creative way that it wasn't necessarily intended to be used for originally. So let's go ahead and start by creating a new folder, and we're going to call this item objects. And we're going to create a duplicate of this and call it item attributes. And then we're going to go into our item objects here, create three new folders. We're going to call one weapon, one armor, and we'll call one amulet. Now inside of our amulet here, create a new game modules create item object. We're going to call this star amulet. Now I can duplicate this, and if I do, I can then simply rename this, and we're going to use a sword and a shield. But as in the other game modules, they do have a unique ID, so we need to click this button to create a new unique ID for those objects. And we'll move the sword into the weapon, and the shield will move into armor. But one thing to note is that right now the item object type is amulet, but when we move this into armor, it's going to update into armor. The type of all of these objects are the name of the folder that they are in. So now we have our sword here, and we're going to click into the stats and try to modify some stats. But as you can see, we don't actually have a stat for attack or armor or anything like that right now, so we need to go ahead and add those. So we're going to add them to our main stats here. Create game modules create stat, and we're going to create an attack and a damage and also armor class, and create some new UIDs there. So for damage, this is going to be something that can be modified, but it can't be trained, and by default it's going to be 0. Attack is similar, it can be modified, not trained, and it's going to be default to 0. And also armor class, modified but not trained, and default to 0. So now when we come back to our sword and we go to our stats, we now see attack, damage, and armor class listed here as well. So we're going to add attack and damage. And for this sword, we're going to say it's 2 attack and say 3 damage. So this is going to be in the game I'm working on. Attack 2 and damage 3 would mean you'd roll a 1 to 3 random number twice, or a 3-sided die twice if you would. And you could get anywhere between 2 and 6 damage points out of that. And on our shield here, we're going to also affect a stat. This is going to be the armor class, and we're going to increase the armor class by 4. And the star amulet is going to do something slightly different. For this one, it's actually not going to do anything by itself. If you wanted to, you could add the armor class and say it gives 1 armor. But for this case, we're not going to do anything at all. Instead, we're going to create an item attribute. In our item attributes folder, we're going to create a new folder, and we're going to call this suffix. And these are for attributes that go at the end of the object name. So create game modules, create item attribute. And for this one, we're going to call this of diminished metabolism. Now, if you remember in our hunger system tutorial, we are able to eat food, and over time our hunger level increases due to our metabolism level. When our metabolism level goes up, hunger goes down faster. We burn through food faster. When metabolism goes down, we burn food less quickly. And so this buff is going to make it so our metabolism is slower and we eat food slower as well. Similar to the item object here, we have a few options up here. First, we're going to use the name of the object as for the human name, and then the name order is going to be 1. The object that this is attached to will always be at position 0, and anything that is negative below 0 will be before the object's name. So in this case, the 1 indicates that the of diminished metabolism will come after the object name. So if we attach it to, say, a sword, it would be sword of diminished metabolism. If I'd switch this to -1, then it would read of diminished metabolism sword, which often isn't desired. So you can control the full name of an object with all of the attributes on it. Now in our stats here, we have the ability to modify stats just like the item object. Any object that has this attribute on it will also have this effect on stats. So we're going to affect the metabolism, and if you remember, our metabolism is based on the proficiency. So if we want to lower our proficiency, we're going to subtract 0.5 from that, which means if it's currently set at 1, which is the default value, adding this would cut that in half, slowing down the rate of our food consumption. Now we definitely want to make sure we open up our properties window in game modules property code and just have this docked right here. After a recent update, this will automatically export if this window is open as we work on things, but we'll just manually do it now. And since we are working with items, we also need the repository in our scene as well. So we're going to drag our repository in there. And if we look at this in the inspector, we can see that we have our item objects and our item attribute listed in that repository. So now it's time to get these items into the player's inventory. For this tutorial, we're going to start with all 3 items in their inventory and not equipped, and then later we'll work on equipping them. So to do this, we're going to utilize the player setup that we started before. As is always the case, there are many ways to bring items and instantiate them into a scene or to add them to a character. This is one way to add items to an inventory when an object is created, or when the scene is loaded, or at the beginning of the game, or something like that. We're going to create a new class here called player setup inventory, and here we're going to have an item object, and we'll call this item. And then underneath that here, we're going to also have a public list of item attribute, and we're going to call this starting attributes. And that way each item can have any number of starting attributes. You could of course expand this to make it a randomized chance of having an item attribute, so maybe it doesn't always have an attribute attached. And then up here we're going to go and copy that, and we'll say player setup inventory is going to be starting items, and we'll make sure that's the right type over there as well. Then underneath add conditions, we're going to say add items. And for this, we're just going to do a simple for each loop. So here we're using the inventory, which is a game item objects list, to use the add method, which takes in a item UID, which is going to be our starting item UID, and the new owner, which of course is the player, and it returns the new item as well. And so now, because we have the new item, we're going to do another for each loop for the attributes and add those if there are any. And so for any one that we do have there, we're just going to say new item add attribute and pass in the UID of the attribute, and that'll add it to the object. So let's go ahead and set that up. We're going to add our 3 elements here. We'll bring in our sword, our star amulet, and our shield. And for the star amulet, we're going to add 1 attribute, and that's going to be the of diminished metabolism. Now it's helpful to be able to see what's in the inventory and the equipment, so we're going to expand the player data viewer here in order to see what's in our inventory and what's in our equipment, and also provide a nice handy button in the inspector that at runtime will allow us to equip or unequip the object. So instead of loading up the player data viewer, we're actually going to load up player data viewer editor. And as a reminder, this uses the Infinity editor, which is my own version of an editor script, which allows for some helpful methods that make editor scripting a little bit easier and far easier to read with much less clutter. So we're going to add up our helpful properties up here by adding another property for our equipment and our inventory. And underneath our show player stats, we're going to add show inventory and equipment. And for this one, I want kind of just two columns, one column of inventory, one column of equipment. So I think what we'll do is we'll start a start row, and always remember to end the row as well, or you'll get some errors. And then we're going to start a vertical column here, and inside this we're also end the vertical, because you always have to end verticals as well. We're going to start a new row. This is going to be our first header row, and this one's going to start with a label, and it's going to say inventory, and we'll make it bold, so true there. And then also it's going, it's going to be 150, then bold goes at the end there. Okay, and then we'll do another label. This is just going to be empty F50, and that's just to keep some spacing proper, because we're going to use that later. And then we're going to do another vertical down here. We'll do this one for equipment. So now we got two verticals here. And underneath this end row, we're going to do a for each for the inventory and just do a display item. We're going to do a new method called display item for each one in the inventory. So we're just going to say display item. And when we don't have this method yet, but when we think about what we need to pass in, we definitely need the item. And since we're going to use this for the equipment as well, and it's going to have a button that lets us transfer the item from one list to another, we need to know the list from and the list to. So in this case, it's going to be from inventory, and it's going to be to equipment. And then finally, we're going to specify that this is true. We're going to say this means we're equipping it, and that's true. And that's going to determine which direction our little button is in the UI here. So I'm going to copy this, and before I create the method, I know we're going to use it for this as well, but instead we're going to do equipment.list and equipment first and inventory second, and then this will be false for that one. So let's go ahead and create this method, and we'll rename the parameters here. We're going to call this from list and to list, and then the boolean here, it will be equip. There we go. That should be good. Let's see, when we display an item, this is going to be in its own row, so start row and end row. That's a good start for many cases. And we need a label that's going to be 150 wide. And for this label, we're going to call the item.fullName. Now, full name will provide the full name, including all attributes, and that's where that of diminished metabolism comes into play. When the item has that on it, it will be displayed as part of the full name rather than the object name. And this is going to be a width of 150. And then we're going to say if button, and the button's going to say something, and the button's also going to be 50 wide. Then we're going to do stuff. And what do we need the button to say here? Let's see. Well, we know it's going to either be a left arrow or a right arrow. I've got some symbols for that in my Infinity editor script here. So we're going to just say if equip, then we will do symbol caret right, and otherwise symbol caret left. Yeah, and that should do it. So it will show a left or a right caret depending on. Let's create another property up here for that. So we'll do private player inventory, and that's going to be script dot player dot get component player inventory. And since this is an editor script, we're not going to worry about the cost of using get component. It's not going to be a very big issue here. And while we're at it, let's go ahead and do a new one for just player as well. Because I notice that I keep writing script.player, and if we do player, then we can remove all of these script.player. So now if we push the button, we're going to say if we're equipping, then we will ask for player object to equip the item. And if we're unequipping, so if we're not equip, then we're going to say player inventory.unequip the item. we'll have to create those two methods. And then always exit GUI here. This is going to change the lists themselves, and so the inspector will throw a small error when this happens unless you exit the GUI first. So let's go ahead and create these methods. Alright, so if we're going to be equipping something, then that means we're going to ask our inventory to transfer to equipment, the item, and make the owner the player. And this new method, transfer to, will move from one list to another the item, the exact item, and it will also remove that item from the initial list all in one call here. And then we're going to do a similar thing down here for the unequip. We're going to ask the equipment to transfer to inventory, the item, and set the owner to player. Now, when we do this, that's going to change, when we equip or unequip, that's going to change the stats on the player. In order to make sure that the stats are updated, we need to tell those stats that they're now dirty and they should update themselves. So we're going to say set stats dirty and pass in the item. And we'll do this on both. And since we're doing it on both, we'll create a new method for it. And this method is just going to do one thing. So we'll do this, and we're going to say player.set stats dirty, and we're going to pass in the item.directly affects, and this is going to be a list of stats that this item directly affects. And make sure that's set stats dirty, which is expecting a list of stats, a stat list. Now back on our star amulet, now that we have our suffix created there, we want to click over to the item attributes and toggle both of these on. And then we're going to toggle on the type suffix and the specific suffix of diminished metabolism. This allows this object to have that attribute. There could be some item objects in your game that aren't allowed to have attributes. And while you can, of course, control that manually, if you're going to be using anything that's automated, such as our loot box system, that will choose item objects to have attributes on a random dice throw, for instance, then that system will need to know which suffixes or other types of item attributes are allowed to be on that object. And you're going to have some objects that perhaps can have an item or attribute, or while others do not. So this allows you to specify that. And before we check to see if these all show up properly in the inspector, we need to go back over to our players and look at the tick and make sure that we're calling the tick for our equipment. And that's going to be very important because the items that are equipped will only run their methods, such as checking to see if they affect any stats, if you call this tick method. And it's very easy to forget to add it. So don't forget to add the tick like I just did. And one other thing you should never forget to add is the other modification levels. And so we're going to add to our get other levels method here, other modification levels.add range. And we're going to add in our equipment.get modification levels, just like our conditions there. Now when we check out the player, we see our stats here. We can bring over the sword and see that our attack and damage went up. We can bring over our shield and see that our armor class went up. And we can notice that the speed of the hunger is going down every 3 seconds, which is 1 in-game minute. It's going down by 1. We're going to bring over our star amulet of diminished metabolism, and now our metabolism is 0.5 and our hunger level is going down every 3 seconds still, but it's going down half as much. And now when we get poisoned, our metabolism goes up to 5.5 rather than 6. Now remember, proficiency is additive, and then it modifies the base point value. So by subtracting 0.5, we're not cutting it, the final one, in half at all times. We're simply removing it from the default value of 1. So when you get poisoned, you're actually adding 5 metabolism. Adding the star amulet removes only 0.5. So you're still having a larger impact from the poison. It's just diminished slightly by your amulet here. So there we go. Now we know how to equip items, transferring them from one inventory list to another. This is the same method you would use if you're transferring any object from one game item object list to another. And now let's go one step further and get some visuals for that sword and shield here. Alright, I've created some primitive objects here, a nice shield and a very, very nice metallic sword there. And we've put these underneath our tutorial player just as a shield and a sword. There are multiple ways, again, as always, of doing equipment. In this case, we're going to use a character that has the objects already on their object, on the player itself, and we're simply going to be turning them on and off to signify that they are now equipped. When they're equipped, they'll be turned on. When they're not equipped, they'll be turned off. Now we're going to be using the Prefab and Object Manager, which comes with many of my characters, but you can also grab it here from the Infinity PBR support files. You'll have to include the equipment system and a few other parts of the contents here. You won't need to install everything. You will need to bring in the script static here, this enumerable extensions, the entire equipment system, and ensure that you also have the Infinity editor, which you should have from this project. So now that we have that in our project, we're going to add our Prefab and Object Manager to our player here. And there are other videos that go into more depth about how to set this up. For this, we're just going to create two new groups. One of them is going to be called Sword, and the other one is going to be called Shield. And we're going to say the sword is in the right hand and that the shield is type left hand. That's just helpful for organization purposes for this for right now. But if we did have multiple objects, then when we turn one on, anything that's active would be automatically turned off, and we would also have the ability to set a default for each of these. In this case, we're not going to have a default because we want them to be able to be turned off. We're going to click on Objects and then add our objects. So we will add our shield up here, and we will add our sword down here. So now we can turn these on and off via the inspector here, and they are going to start turned off. That's the setup for the Prefab and Object Manager. So back in our player inventory here, let's create a new reference to that component, and we'll cache that in Awake as well. So now when we equip it, we want to turn on the object, and so we're going to use the Prefab and Object Manager to do that for us. So whenever we turn on the item, we're going to call the Prefab and Object Manager dot activate group, and we're going to need a group name or index. In this case, we definitely need the group name, and we've used sword and shield, and so we could use the object name and see if that works. So let's start by doing that, and then I'll show you a better method using the dictionaries. And similarly, for when we unequip, we're going to say deactivate group of the object name. There we go. So now when we bring the sword on and the shield on, they are equipped, and when we bring them off, they are unequipped. If we bring on the star, there's no prefab group of that name. We get a warning here. This is helpful in case you're debugging and you're saying, hey, why is there something trying to equip there? And so we can de-equip there, and it's going to get a warning as well. But there is a better way of doing this, because you might have multiple objects, different things of different names that all have to turn on the same visual object. And so instead we're going to use the dictionary component here. So in our sword, we're going to click over to dictionaries, and then we're going to click manage item objects. So all dictionary is set up on the manage item objects. Similarly, the dictionaries for stats will be set up on the manage stats. In this case, we have our weapon type selected. We're going to add a new key name here called equipment name, and we'll add that to weapon. Then we'll expand this to expose the string parameter, and we're going to add the same to the armor here as well. And if we go back to our inspector, we then have the string here, and so we're going to use the same name here just to keep it simple for the tutorial, but of course you can use anything you'd like. And sword and shield there, and the amulet's not going to have one at all. Alright, so first I'm going to save my string equipment name up here. Object equipment name key is going to be equipment name. Perhaps this is something you'd save in a static method, static class somewhere in your project. And we're just going to keep that there. So if we ever did need to change it, we'd only have to change it one spot. And I'm going to create a new method here, and this is going to be called manage prefab and object manager. And we're passing the item here, which is a game item object. First thing we're going to do is check to make sure that this dictionary even has that key. The amulet doesn't, so if it doesn't have that, we can just return out. And then if it does, then we're just going to call that string rather than our item object name here. So I'm just going to copy this down here and replace this with item.dictionaries.valueString, and we're going to pass in only the key because we don't want it to be random, and we are okay with bringing in the first index of the index. We only have one, and so we're just going to pass in the object equipment key name, and that should be that. And then we just need to make sure to call this at the bottom here and do the same on our equip. And one more thing to add is the option for also activating a group. So we're going to add a new parameter here, bool, and we'll call this just activate, and then if activate, then we will first cache the key equipment name. We'll start by caching that equipment name so we can skinny that up a little bit. And if we're activating, then we'll do activate group, and otherwise we will do deactivate group. So let's go ahead and try this out. The sword is equipped and unequipped, and the shield is also equipped and unequipped. There we go. So in this tutorial, we've learned a few things. We've expanded on the hunger system by adding items and item attributes, and we've learned about how to create those, how to attach the item attributes to item objects, and how to attach item objects into the scene at the start, just one way of many of doing that. We saw how they affect these stats and how they affect the hunger level in this tutorial when you have the Star Amulet of Diminished Metabolism equipped. We also used the Prefab and Object Manager to do a very simple setup for turning on and off 3D models when those are equipped and unequipped inside the scene. And so now the same method used in this editor script can be used inside the game to very easily, with one line of code, equip an item and have all the stats change, have the visuals change, and everything change. So all you have to worry about is one line of code, and everything else is handled for you. So if you like this tutorial, please let me know. Like, subscribe, and come to the Discord and hang out. And I'll see you next time. Thanks.